Hello everyone, this is Jack with Let's Draw Today. Thank you so much for joining me and drawing with me today. Have you ever wished to draw a chrysanthemum flower, but you could never really follow through because of the overwhelming feeling of complexity brought on by its huge quantity of petals? Well, today we're going to learn how to draw a chrysanthemum in as many wondrous petals by taking an approach that simplifies the process and still leaves us with the realistic representation. Here's a look at the reference photo I'm using to guide me. I'll use both a black and white and a color version of the reference. Are you ready to draw a chrysanthemum? Great, let's do it. I'm sketching this in a sketch pad that is 8.5 by 5.5 inches, and the first thing I did here was I marked both sides of my sketch paper with a straight vertical line, 3/4 of an inch from the left and right side of the paper, just to make the dimensions of my sketching space comparable to the 8 by 10 reference photo. Then I used light marks to indicate the placement of the uppermost edge and the extreme left edge of the petals compared to the edges of the reference photo and my sketching space. I've repeated this with the extreme right edge of the petals, taking note that this point is just about in alignment with the horizontal center of my paper. I repeated this once more to locate the lowest outer edge of petals. Now that we've located the farthest reach of the petals in each direction, we can begin to block in the general overall shape of the mass of petals. Starting at the left side, we can keep this very simple to begin with by using only straight lines to connect the edges. And we can begin to form a shape that will slowly resemble the overall organic shape of all the chrysanthemum's petals. Now, as for the stem, I noticed that it is a little left of the vertical center line of the reference photo. So to help me locate the stem, as well as other parts of the chrysanthemum, I can first locate the center of the page by using some light guidelines. Then I can better place the stem in the proper position and angle. Now let's block in the rest of the flower. We can begin from the stem going to the right, just beyond our imaginary vertical line, our imaginary vertical center line, and then toward the lower edge. From this point, we can sketch a diagonal line toward the right edge. Then from the upper left corner, we can sketch a line at a slight downward slope followed by a much steeper diagonal toward the right edge. Okay, as for the stem, it has a little piece branching off here. Next, we can block in the shape of the leaf. Again, we're only using straight lines for the moment. We can use these lines as a framework for creating more curved and more certain lines as we go on. The last step for blocking in our chrysanthemum is to locate the center of the petals. Taking a look at the reference, we can see that it is slightly left of and a little ways above the center mark of our paper. We can place a light round mark where we think it should be, and then we can confirm that this is a realistic placement by tracing the path from our stem toward this mark. With this leaf, we can use these initial guidelines to build up and better define its shape. We'll put some of the pointy tips here for now, and we'll shape up the rest of the leaf later. Okay, now as for the petals, at first glance, it may seem very intimidating to draw all of these. You have to remember, though, that we can still achieve a realistic representational sketch without having to draw each and every petal we see. This first petal we're starting with is an outer petal. The larger outer petals of our chrysanthemum are much easier to identify individually than the countless tiny petals closer to the center. So, our approach for the sketch will be to draw the outer petals first and work our way inward. Let's draw the next 3 petals to the left of this first one. These petals are easy to identify on our reference photo, making it easier to replicate them with the appropriate shape and size and positioning. Notice that all 4 of these are to the lower left of the center of our sketch paper. Moving on, let's go to the next petals that we see. When sketching each petal, don't be too concerned about getting it exact. Just try your best to replicate the basic shape of each petal, positioning it and sizing it based on the reference and the other petals and parts of the drawing you already have on your paper up to this point. Although all the petals of this flower are very similar, you may notice some unique shapes to each one as you sketch them individually. For instance, these petals look like long pointy fingers. One thing I didn't mention earlier is to make sure you are keeping your lines light while drawing these petals. So while sketching this, I made the mistake of thinking I was using an HB pencil when I actually had a 2B this whole time. So you can see me here switching to the HB pencil. Let's sketch a few more petals here on the left side. Okay, now let's move over here to the lower right side. Now, the reason I just mentioned keeping your lines light is because the petals of this chrysanthemum are very light in value. Starting with the 2B like I did isn't a big deal because there's not a very noticeable difference between an HB and 2B pencil, and there's a little more shadow on the left side of this flower anyway. Okay, with these petals, with the petals you see me sketching now, you'll notice that I'm pulling away from that outer diagonal line because the petals don't extend that far until we get back up near the top. We'll finish up outlining the outer petals by sketching the ones here at the top. As you sketch the shape of each petal, use the reference, but at the same time, keep it loose and general. You don't have to sketch each petal exactly as you see it in the reference photo. These petals generally follow the path of the guidelines we have here that when we blocked in the flower's overall shape earlier. Now that we have completed the outer petals, we can begin to gradually work our way toward the center by drawing the inner petals. Starting along the lower edge, we can make another row of petals here, similar to the first ones we did. As we work our way from the outside toward the inside, we can rely a little less on the reference and worry a little less about drawing each petal so precisely. Now we can sketch a few more petals here at the upper left. Notice how the petals in this row here, they're curving and pointing in a manner very similar to the petals behind them. The majority of all the petals of the chrysanthemum should point toward that center spot. Okay, we'll go ahead and sketch more petals here at the upper right. You see how as I cross over the path of the center of the flower, my petals began to change shape. Here, they're becoming much smaller, more narrow, kind of pointy ovals. Then the petals to the right of that are curving in a direction flip opposite to those at the left. You'll notice also that with each row of petals that gets closer to the center, the petals become smaller and smaller, but they still stay a comparable size and shape to the other petals alongside them. Make sure each of these close petals is pointing at that center spot. Now that we're closing in on the center, we're going to focus on the center and work outward. Use the reference as a guide to draw the shape of the tips of the petals that are at the very center. They should all be converging at that center point and touching one another and then radiating outward. Then we can continue to add more petals circling the center to fill in the remaining gap. At this point, the outline for our chrysanthemum sketch is essentially complete. We can use a kneaded or plastic eraser to erase any guidelines we still see on our paper. Okay, now on to shading. Still sticking with the HB pencil for now, let's begin to shade the petals on the left side of the chrysanthemum. The left side of the flower is going to be slightly darker overall than the right due to less light. As you shade each petal, apply the most shading on the lower part of the petal that is deeper inside the flower and receiving the least amount of light. As you shade the outer petals on the left side, you can add detail simply by using some darker marks to represent the inner grooves of these petals. Continue shading the petals on the left part of the flower. Occasionally, use the reference to copy what you see on specific petals, like this one, to add texture and other subtleties. Shade the petals on the right side of the flower in the same manner. There's slightly more light on this side, but not much. Since the chrysanthemum is white, we're keeping the general overall shading very light to present a soft, delicate look with our flower sketch. Again, with the petals in the foreground, we can be a little more deliberate with our details. Refer to the reference more often with these petals to guide you as to where to apply shading or other characteristic lines on the surface of each petal. Next, we can apply a base layer of shading on the stem with our HB pencil. There should be slightly more shading on the left side of the stem. We'll do the same with the leaf. This leaf is folded over, so let's draw a line here to indicate that fold. Then we'll add some light shading to the leaf with just a little more shadow under the fold. Next, let's add a little more contrast to the sketch with a 2B pencil. Make sure your pencil is nice and sharp. Then, starting at the center, draw lines that branch outward to represent the very thin shadows between each of the petals. Add some darker shadow to a few of the petals slightly farther away from the center. Remember to focus on the lowest part of each petal. Emphasize slightly more shading and detail with the petals on the left side. Also, we can sketch some darker grooves along the edges between some of these petals in the front. Continue to use the reference to add slightly darker tones as needed on the petals of the flower. Pay special attention to the petals at the outer edges and add shading to the deepest parts and on the top where they get shadow from the petals above them. There's a large amount of contrasting value between the white petals and the dark stem. Switching to a 4B pencil now, let's start placing some shadow at the very top of the stem, just below the petals. As you bring your shading down the stem, try to maintain a thin strip of lighter value along the left edge. This reflected light will serve to separate the similar dark values of the stem and the leaf to the left. We can continue shading the stem, working our way down and making a gradual transition from darker core shadow values on the left side of the stem to lighter, more mid-tone values on the stem's right side. Let's shade this little branching part of the stem in the same way. There'll be more shading along the left side and near the petals, and actually most of the stem itself, leaving a little strip of the reflected light along the right side this time. Okay, let's add another layer of tones to the main stem to match the darker value on the right. We still want to preserve a thin, lighter value along the right edge of the stem. Now we can place more shading on the leaf. The values here will be very similar to what we see on the stem. Make sure to leave a thin strip of lighter value along the top edge of the leaf where it's flipped over. This will help to distinguish the top surface from the other side of the leaf that we see underneath with that deep shadow. Okay, now we'll finish the leaf by shading the portion that is to the left of the stem. And you can draw a subtle indication or two of a vein and put some more shadow on the underside if you wish. All right, we're just about finished with our chrysanthemum sketch here. all that is left is to compare to the reference photo and compare nearby values on the sketch itself, adding details and shading as needed. The last step is to erase any remaining guidelines or smudges. An optional step would be to shade in the background. This would help to bring more contrast to the edges of the white petals and maybe even make the flower pop a little more, but it all depends on how much time you have and how far you want to go and how happy you are with your sketch as it is. And that is how to draw a chrysanthemum. If you found this video to be helpful, please like it, leave a comment, share, and subscribe to my channel. And be sure to click on the notification bell so you don't miss new videos. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for drawing with me today.